Billy, Frida, and Jesse. From the outside, 1117, Morningside Avenue appeared to be an ordinary American home. White-paneled and 2 stories tall, it served as a comfortable residence for Billy Isom, Frida Bostic, and Jesse Haney. However, when the 3 were discovered dead inside one winter morning, the atmosphere of the home changed drastically. As police sought to uncover the secrets hidden within its walls, the once cozy structure became haunting and ominous, offering no answers to one of Iowa's most disturbing crimes. In today's episode, we'll delve into this heartbreaking mystery. On the morning of December 3, 1974, Harriet Isom drove across Sioux City, Iowa, to her son's home at 1117 Morningside Avenue. 27-year-old Ernest Billy Isom Jr. had not been seen for 2 days, nor had his housemate, 26-year-old Jesse Haney, or Billy's pregnant 24-year-old girlfriend, Frida Bostic. Both men worked alongside Billy's father at Port Neal Station, and his father had grown increasingly alarmed by their absence. He called Harriet from work, asking her to stop by and check on them. Accompanied by a neighbor, Harriet made the drive to Morningside Avenue. Upon entering the 2-story home, she was met with silence. Making her way to the dining room, she found Frida lying face down on the floor, her arms tucked beneath her body. She was barefoot, dressed in a floral print dressing gown, and had been shot once in the back. Moving toward the living room, Harriet found another body, Jesse, still wearing his winter jacket, propped up against the hallway door. He had been shot once in the back and once behind the left ear. But the worst discovery was yet to come. Billy lay unclothed, face down on the floor, half on the mattress he and Frida used as a bed. He had been shot twice in the back and 3 times in the head. Horrified, Harriet and her neighbor fled from the home and rushed to a nearby phone booth to alert law enforcement. Off-duty police officer Norman Cronick was the first to arrive, being the nearest member of the force to the Morningside Avenue residence. Soon after, detectives began forming theories about what might have occurred inside the home. Former Sioux City Police Chief Joe Frisbee, who served as the lead investigator on the case, stated, "When you have a situation like this, a thing in a house in the middle of the night, that narrows the field tremendously. The people we were focusing on were people they knew. There is no doubt in my mind they knew the perpetrator. At the crime scene, there was no indication of forced entry. After thoroughly examining the house, investigators found nothing missing and no signs of a break-in, suggesting this was not a burglary gone wrong. Blood spatter patterns suggested that the murders had been committed at close range. The autopsies confirmed much of what detectives already suspected. The trio's time of death was estimated to be within 24 hours before their discovery, and it was believed that the shots were fired as they tried to escape the gunman. The victim's 2 dogs were also found inside the house, one locked in the bathroom. Fortunately, both animals were unharmed, but they provided no clues to what had transpired within the previous day. It was determined that all 3 victims had been killed using a .380 caliber semi-automatic weapon. Yet, despite extensive door-to-door inquiries, no neighbors reported hearing or seeing anything unusual. Just hours after news of the killings spread, 2 men appeared with Billy's green 1974 Datsun, which had been missing from the driveway. The men claimed they were friends of the victims and said they had borrowed the car a few days earlier, insisting they knew nothing about the murders committed inside the home. Authorities accepted their explanation and released them without pressing any charges. Meanwhile, rumors circulated throughout the town about what might have happened to the trio. Some speculated that Jesse had brought the killer home after a night of partying, while others believed that drug dealers from Colorado or Montana had ordered a hit. Another theory suggested that the 2 men had stirred anti-union sentiment at the port, angering their co-workers and leading to retaliation. At the same time, investigators learned that Jesse, Billy, and Frida had only been living in Sioux City for about a month, and that each had come from a different state. Jesse was born in Billings, Montana, in 1948 and had spent most of his life in Red Lodge, around 800 miles from Sioux City. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. From an early age, he dreamed of becoming an engineer, but after a difficult breakup, his life took a downward turn, causing him to drop out of school and briefly serve in the military. Upon returning, he bought a house in Billings that was reportedly meant to serve as a refuge for his friends, many of whom were involved in drug trafficking. but it soon turned into a haven for addicts and dealers, something that deeply frustrated Jesse. Eventually, he left Montana and began taking whatever jobs he could find, ultimately ending up in Colorado, where he met Ernest Billy Isom Jr. and a woman named Susan, who became his girlfriend. Billy, meanwhile, had been born in Hammond, Indiana, in 1947. He was the only child of Harriet and Ernest Sr., and much of his youth was spent moving from place to place as his father's job required. He served briefly in the military, during which he was wounded twice while overseas. After returning from Vietnam, he began working various odd jobs and eventually crossed paths with Frida and Jesse. Little is known about Frida's background, except that she was born in 1950 in Greensboro, North Carolina, and had a strong passion for art. Investigators observed that Billy, Jesse, and Frida had kept a low profile for about 6 weeks before arriving in Sioux City. They theorized that the three had been hiding out before choosing to relocate, hoping to disappear into the community unnoticed. Because they were newcomers to the area, authorities struggled to locate anyone who truly knew them. The only person with any genuine connection to the group was Jesse's girlfriend, Susan, who had returned to Colorado roughly a week before the murders took place. Although she was never officially treated as a suspect, several officers believed she knew more than she admitted. Officer Russell White Jr., who worked on the case, later remarked, "They found the woman, and she didn't know anything. I never believed that, and I still don't today." With few leads to pursue, detectives decided to reconstruct the trio's final movements in hopes of uncovering clues that might illuminate the case. It was determined that Jesse and Billy had been absent from work for 2 days, but had been deceased for roughly 1 day when their bodies were discovered. The reason for their absence the day prior to the shooting remained uncertain. Police reportedly received information suggesting that the men might have quit their jobs due to ongoing anti-union disputes at their workplace. Police Captain Frank O'Keefe stated that there had been a walkout in which both men had participated, which might explain why they failed to appear at work before their deaths. However, whether this was the actual cause remains unclear, as even Ernest Sr. was unsure whether the two had been sick, striking, or missing for another reason. On November 28th, the trio shared dinner with Billy's parents. 2 days later, on Saturday, November 30th, they went to a bar known as the Jet, where they socialized and had a good time. That evening, they invited friends back to their house to continue the party. Nothing seemed to go wrong that night, except that the house was reportedly left in disarray afterward. Frida and Billy had arranged to visit Harriet and Ernest Sr. again the next day, on December 1st, but they never arrived. Later that evening, a friend of the group stopped by the home and knocked on the door, but received no answer. Assuming the group was either out or occupied, the friend simply left the property. Then, on December 2nd, the group's landlord came by to collect the rent for the month. He noticed there were no footprints or tire tracks in the snow and assumed the trio had gone out of town for Thanksgiving and had yet to return. Without knocking or checking inside, he left the property, intending to return a few days later. Strangely, investigators later learned that Harriet had not been the first person to enter the house after the murders. On the morning of December 3rd, before she arrived to check on her son, an IPS meter reader had visited the home. When no one answered his knock, he entered through the back door and headed straight to the basement. He later told police that on his way there, he noticed a woman lying on her side near the fireplace, but chose not to look any closer, not wanting to intrude. Instead, he proceeded downstairs, took the meter readings, and left the premises. On December 4th, the day after the bodies were discovered, police announced that they had detained a couple for questioning in relation to the case. One member of the pair was a co-worker of Jesse and Billy who had resigned from his job on December 2nd, the same day the trio was killed. According to investigators, the man and his partner had abruptly left the Sioux City area in the early hours of the morning, roughly 10 hours before the victims were found. The timing of their departure from the city appeared highly suspicious to investigators and seemed far more sinister than a simple coincidence. The couple was apprehended on December 4th, just outside Carlsbad, New Mexico. Authorities there had been requested by investigators to detain them for questioning in connection with the murders. Police Captain Frank O'Keefe stated that they were not considered suspects, but since they were friends of the victims, officers felt their unusual behavior warranted further questioning. The couple was later identified as 25-year-old Van L. Chadwick and 18-year-old Diana Lindley. They were interrogated throughout much of December 5th, and were eventually administered polygraph tests, which they passed. Consequently, they were released without charges. No definitive link was ever established between Lindley and Chadwick and the murders of Frida, Jesse, and Billy. Following their release, they were no longer deemed persons of interest. Within weeks of the killings, it became evident that investigative leads were dwindling. Police carried out hundreds of interviews nationwide, yet the case gradually came to a standstill, with one county attorney remarking, "We're still hoping something new will turn up." Law enforcement had no known motive, no witnesses, and no suspects. Although they possessed extensive evidence, including bloody clothing, bullets, carpet fragments, and crime scene photographs, none of it appeared to yield significant progress. In April 1975, a person was subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury regarding matters connected to the murders. However, the outcome of that testimony remains unknown, as no information about it was ever released to the public. That same month, the house at 1117 Morningside Avenue was demolished to make room for a parking lot. Authorities had theorized early in the investigation that the murders were drug-related. Joe Frisbie stated that both men had been shot in what appeared to be execution style. Ray Haney, Jesse's brother, later recalled that when he last saw his sibling, he seemed both tired and uneasy, saying, "He said they were after him." Reportedly, during that same weekend, November 23rd, shortly before his death, Jesse had mentioned to a friend a drug deal he was preparing to carry out. He allegedly planned to deceive the dealer, but never revealed further details of his scheme. All anyone seemed to know was that he expected to make a considerable amount of money if it succeeded. Ray added, "He tried telling me what was going on, but he didn't tell me enough." In 1992, Ray told the Sioux City Journal, "There isn't any question about it." It was a hit. Many members of Jesse's family believed that he had become deeply involved in the world of illegal narcotics and had entangled himself with dangerous individuals who did not take kindly to betrayal. Officer Russell White Jr. later noted that shortly before their deaths, the trio had been partying with people connected to drug trafficking, adding that marijuana and traces of harder drugs had been found in the home. He further remarked, "It wasn't a crime of passion, and robbery wasn't a motive. The only motivation we believed for the actual killing was that somebody wanted them dead." Throughout the course of the investigation, numerous detectives remarked on the cold-blooded, composed, and methodical nature in which the killings were executed, leading to speculation that the perpetrator had been hired to carry out the murders. It was theorized by some that Frida had been killed merely as a witness, since she was shot in the torso rather than in the head, and only once. However, Captain Lisa Clays proposed a different interpretation. She suggested that Frida may have interrupted a conversation Jesse and Billy were having with the killer, which startled him into opening fire. Clays told the Sioux City Journal, "She comes through the door, and that was the trigger. She spooked them. And I think this guy fired 2 times. The first one missed, the second one hit. If this theory holds true, then Frida would have been shot from the front instead of from behind." Captain Clays added, "This might give us a whole different picture of how this happens, which then might make us start looking at a whole different set of characters." Joe Frisbie also observed that the trio seemed to anticipate some sort of retaliation, as they were known to leave the house armed, even carrying high-caliber handguns inside their lunchboxes. Jesse's .357 caliber revolver was found in a lunchbox in his 1968 blue Chevrolet, which remained parked in the driveway. But it wasn't solely drug activity that could have drawn trouble their way during their lives. Frida had reportedly been involved in various credit card scams, with investigators stating they'd been using phony credit cards and were involved in buying and selling plastic. Investigators also learned of an anonymous tip that had allegedly been called in to a Sioux City television station. The caller claimed that Jesse had testified in federal court in Denver against a major drug kingpin earlier in 1974. Both Billy and Frida had previous arrests for narcotics possession. Billy had been charged with marijuana possession in Kansas and had served a brief sentence in prison, as had Frida. After investigators returned from New Mexico, where they had questioned Chadwick and Lindley, they received a phone call from an individual who said they had seen a television report about the murders that evening and possessed information concerning the crime. According to Joe Frisbie, there were individuals in eastern Iowa who had witnessed a disagreement between one of the victims and a person the police were seeking to interview. He stated there was some bad blood between them and this other group of people. The result of this lead remains unclear, but evidently, whatever information law enforcement uncovered was insufficient to bring the case to a conclusion. Although investigators continued to pursue the case for several years following the deaths of Jesse, Billy, and Frida, their families never received closure. The investigation remains officially open to this day. Some of the officers who had worked on the original 1974 case still believe it may eventually be solved. However, an article from the Sioux City Journal notes that Joe Frisbee has largely lost hope. Fortunately, the evidence collected from the case has been preserved and remains available for future investigators. Sadly, Billy's father passed away in 1987, while his mother died more recently in 2015. Likewise, both of Jesse's parents and Frida's mother are deceased. None of them lived to see justice served for their children. Captain Clays said of the case, "To the living, we owe respect. To the dead, we owe the truth." She added, "There is always hope for justice in this or any unsolved case." Moving on to the next case. Chad Dorman. On June 15, 2023, Chad Dorman returned home early from work and asked his 3 sons and wife to join him in the main bedroom to take a nap. After they all lay down on the bed, Dorman opened his gun safe and took out a rifle. He then shot Hunter twice, killing him instantly. His wife immediately tried to help Hunter while urging the other 2 boys to run. At that moment, the stepdaughter, who had been watching television, entered the bedroom and witnessed the first gunshots. She chased after Clayton, shouting for him to keep running. Dorman pursued Clayton into a nearby field, shot him in the back, and then fired a point-blank shot to his head. The suspect carried Clayton's body back to the yard of the house. The stepdaughter then went back inside, picked up Chase, and fled toward the road. Dorman followed her and pointed the rifle at her, demanding she put Chase down. He attempted to fire, but the weapon was out of ammunition. Chase ran toward his mother, who was now in the yard trying to save Clayton's life. The stepdaughter escaped and told a passing driver what her stepfather was doing before continuing to run toward the nearby Monroe Township Fire Department. Dorman then returned inside the house, carried Hunter's body outside, and placed it in the yard. He then tried to pull Chase away from his wife, reportedly biting her during the struggle. When she managed to seize the rifle, Dorman fired, hitting his wife in the thumb. She dropped Chase, and Dorman then shot the child in the head. He placed Chase's body beside his brother's and sat on the side stoop of the house, watching as his wife desperately tried to revive the boys until police arrived at 4:25 p.m. Chad Dorman was born in 1990 in Ohio, USA, and was the beloved only child of Kit and Gloria Dorman. From the beginning, he was the pride of his parents. Chad's upbringing was fairly typical. His family was middle class, and he made it through elementary and high school without major problems. He wasn't a remarkable student, but managed to pass his classes and stay out of trouble. However, things began to decline when Chad reached adulthood. He developed a habit of heavy drinking and reckless driving, which resulted in numerous traffic citations and fines. On one occasion, he crashed his car and fled the scene, ignoring several court summonses. The pivotal moment came in 2010 when Chad was accused of domestic violence against his own father. Despite the charge, his father refused to testify, unwilling to see his son face punishment, and the case was dismissed. Yet history repeated itself when Chad was again accused of domestic violence, this time by a partner. As before, the case was dropped because no one was willing to support the charges, still clinging to the belief that Chad would eventually change. And change he did, at least for a time, after meeting Laura. He fell deeply in love with her, undeterred by the fact that she had a daughter, Alexis, from a previous marriage. Before long, they began their life together, moving into a residential neighborhood in Monroe, Claremont County. Their family expanded with the births of 3 sons, Clayton, Hunter, and Chase. By early 2023, Chad was 32 years old, Laura was 34, Alexis was 16, and the boys were 7, 4, and 3 years old respectively. The Dorman family settled comfortably into their quiet community. During their free time, Clayton and Hunter loved playing baseball. Their coach spoke highly of them, always noting how energetic and cheerful they were during practice. He described Hunter as a natural jokester and Clayton as the more serious one, always focused on executing the plays correctly and motivating his teammates. Though both boys shared a passion for sports, their other interests differed. Clayton enjoyed building with Lego, riding his go-kart, playing with his dog, and especially looking after his younger brothers. Hunter, the more daring of the two, often played outside, splashing in the creek or jumping on the trampoline, always displaying affection toward his family. Every day, he would tell his mother and sister how much he loved them. Even though Chase was still very young, he had already shown a vivid imagination, spending much of his time pretending to be a superhero. The rest of the time, he stayed close to Laura, sharing a deep, special attachment. The community frequently remarked on how united the Doorman family seemed, impressed by their closeness and the happy moments they shared. Yet behind closed doors, the reality was far different. Neighbors often heard Chad shouting at Laura and the children, with hardly a day passing without some angry outburst. Close friends observed the situation worsening, describing Chad as a ticking time bomb. The abuse escalated until Laura began threatening to leave him. Despite the tension at home, Chad tried to maintain a positive image in public. In June 2023, he updated his Facebook profile picture to one featuring his 3 sons, followed by more posts, including one taken at the baseball field showing Clayton, Hunter, and Chase giving thumbs-ups, an image that gave the impression of a happy family. At the time, the photo raised no suspicion and appeared to depict a loving, stable household. Those who knew about Chad's abusive tendencies chose not to step in, hoping the situation at home was improving. On Wednesday, the 14th of the month, the boys had a baseball game. Chad, Laura, and Chase attended to cheer them on. After the game, the head of the New Richmond Sports Association noticed Chad helping the children into their car seats, appearing caring and responsible, an image that concealed his true nature. Unbeknownst to everyone present, that would be the last time the children were seen alive. The following day, Chad returned home early from work and asked his wife and children to join him in the master bedroom for a nap. While the rest of the family lay asleep in the master bedroom, Chad's 12-year-old stepdaughter sat in the family room watching television. Once everyone had fallen asleep, Chad opened the drawer of his nightstand, revealing a small safe from which he retrieved a rifle. He woke his 3 sons and positioned them in a line, placing Hunter at the front. What happened next was an act of unimaginable horror. Doorman fired twice at Hunter, killing him instantly. Laura awoke to the sound of gunfire and screamed in terror. She ran to Hunter's side, trying to help, and shouted for her other 2 sons to run. Meanwhile, Alexis, who had been watching television in the next room, heard the gunshots and rushed into the bedroom. She saw her stepfather chasing Clayton and immediately followed after them. Clayton ran toward a nearby field, but despite his desperate speed, Chad caught up with him, turning the moment into a twisted pursuit. He shot the boy as he ran, causing him to collapse, then approached and fired another shot at close range. He carried Clayton's lifeless body back to the yard. Having seen this, Alexis hurried inside to grab Chase, determined to protect him. Her intention was to flee toward the nearest road, but before she could escape the house, Chad caught up with them once more. He ordered her to put Chase down, but she refused. When he tried to shoot, the gun clicked empty, out of ammunition. At that moment, Laura appeared in the yard, frantically attempting to resuscitate Clayton, though her efforts were futile. Alexis set Chase down, telling him to run to his mother while she went for help. The little boy dashed into Laura's arms for safety. In the meantime, Chad went back inside, reloaded his gun, and returned outside carrying Hunter's body. After laying Hunter in the yard, he attempted to seize Chase from Laura's grasp. A struggle followed, during which Chad bit Laura's hand before shooting her in the same spot. She dropped Chase, and Chad took hold of him. He then shot the little boy in the head. Seemingly satisfied with his actions, Chad placed Chase's body beside his brother's and sat on the side porch, coldly watching as his wife tried in vain to revive their sons. It was 4:14 p.m. when Laura realized that nothing more could be done. She called the police, screaming hysterically that her babies were gone. The father had fired a total of 9 rounds. One son was shot once, while the other 2 had each been shot 4 times. Meanwhile, Alexis was sprinting toward the Monroe fire station, crying out for help. A passing neighbor stopped her car and asked what had happened. Alexis told her that her stepfather had killed everyone at home. The neighbor offered her a ride, but Alexis refused, saying she could not abandon her family, and continued running toward the fire station. The neighbor parked and called the police, relaying what Alexis had said. When dispatchers asked if she could approach the house, the woman refused, afraid she might also be shot. By then, 911 operators had already received 2 calls reporting the incident and had dispatched officers to the Doorman residence. Meanwhile, several neighbors, having heard the gunfire, stepped outside into their yards to see what was happening, unaware of the horrific extent of the tragedy that had just unfolded. At 4:30 p.m., police officers arrived at the scene. They found Chad sitting calmly on the front step, rifle in hand, stating plainly that he would not resist arrest and admitting to his crimes, urging officers to take him to jail. In the tense footage from the police body cameras, viewers can see the moment law enforcement apprehended Chad Dorman. The atmosphere is thick with tension as officers cautiously approach, capturing the crucial exchange that led to his arrest. Although Chad appeared composed, the immense gravity of the situation was undeniable. As he was taken into custody, attention quickly turned to the 3 children, who were discovered lying motionless in the yard, each with gunshot wounds. Paramedics attempted CPR, but were unable to revive them. Within minutes, the heartbreaking deaths of the 3 children were officially confirmed. Focus then shifted to Laura, who had sustained a gunshot wound to her hand that, fortunately, was not life-threatening. She was transported to the University of Cincinnati Medical Center, screaming at Chad that he had ruined her life as paramedics loaded her into the ambulance. The arrest proceeded without resistance, though as Chad was about to be placed in the patrol car, he oddly cautioned officers about the family dog and ordered the pet to return inside the house. The property was sealed off with yellow police tape as investigators planned to return the following day for a detailed forensic examination. That night, Chad was charged with 3 counts of aggravated murder. When investigators returned to the residence the next morning, they found no evidence of forced entry, confirming that Chad had acted alone. During his initial statement, Chad chillingly confessed that he had been planning the attack since the previous October and claimed he had not slept for 3 days before the murders, consumed by thoughts of killing his children. On June 16th, Chad made his first court appearance, wearing a padded green vest meant to prevent self-harm and escorted by 6 deputies, reflecting concern he might become violent. During the hearing, he openly admitted to lining up his 3 children before executing them. Witness statements were presented, including one from a neighbor who saw Clayton attempting to flee from Chad. The evidence against Chad was overwhelming. His defense requested bail set at $75,000, arguing that his long-term relationship with Laura, along with his lack of stable employment and community ties, made him a minimal flight risk. However, prosecutors demanded an unprecedented $20 million bail, the highest ever proposed in Ohio, effectively ensuring Chad would remain in custody. The judge sided with the prosecution. The Claremont County Prosecutor's Office described the killings as the most horrific crime they had ever encountered, condemning Chad's betrayal of his children's innocence and their fundamental need for love, care, and protection. The prosecutor emphasized the savage nature of Chad's actions, particularly his pursuit of Clayton, and criticized the community for overlooking the warning signs of Chad's violent behavior. The hearing concluded with Chad facing 9 counts of aggravated murder, 1 for each shot fired at his children, along with 8 counts of kidnapping and 4 counts of assault. He was remanded to the Claremont County Jail as the investigation continued. On June 23rd, a grand jury formally indicted Chad on 21 counts, sparking public outrage when he entered a plea of not guilty. The Claremont County prosecutor noted that the aggravated murder charges carried the potential for the death penalty. He urged the court to deny bail entirely, arguing that no monetary amount could justify the severity of the crime. The case quickly drew intense media attention, with crowds gathering outside the courthouse demanding swift justice and calling for Chad's execution. Public opinion remained divided after the hearing. Some supported the prosecutor's push for the death penalty, while others favored life imprisonment, insisting that Chad should live to fully face the consequences of his actions. Despite differing views, one sentiment united the public: Chad deserved the harshest punishment possible. Amid the nationwide outrage, Chad's father continued to defend him, expressing both grief and disbelief during interviews. He described his son's actions as an episode of sudden madness, a claim that contradicted Chad's earlier confession of having planned the killings months in advance. Meanwhile, Laura and her family struggled to cope with the devastation. Alexis required psychological care to process the trauma, and Rachel, the children's aunt, launched a GoFundMe campaign to help cover funeral expenses. She stated that while a guilty verdict might deliver justice, it would never heal the family's pain, leaving them only with memories of the bright, joyful boys they had lost. On June 25th, the New Richmond Sports Association held a vigil at the local baseball field, selling T-shirts to raise funds for Laura's family. Community members visited the Dorman home, leaving toys, candles, and flowers in memory of the children. A funeral service took place on June 26th at the First Baptist Church. Laura asked mourners to wear bright, colorful clothing to honor her son's happy spirits. Yet, beneath the cheerful colors, the grief was unmistakable, especially among the children's friends, who struggled to comprehend the tragedy. During the service, the boys' coach delivered a heartfelt speech, recalling the irreplaceable time spent with them and the joy they brought to everyone around them. On September 22nd, a pre-trial hearing was held, setting Chad's trial for July 8, 2024, with proceedings expected to continue until August 12th of the same year. It was determined that Chad would remain in custody at the Claremont County Jail, with bail maintained at $20 million. To this day, the motive behind the murders remains unclear. Some reports suggest that Chad may have sought revenge against Laura, who was allegedly planning to leave him due to his history of violence toward her and the children. Chad, however, has not addressed these claims and continues to refuse cooperation with investigators. In February 2024, during a court session, Chad's defense attorneys requested that the judge dismiss the statements he made during police questioning, citing procedural violations and rights infringements. The judge granted the motion, ruling that Chad's confessions could not be used as evidence, as his rights had not been properly upheld following his arrest. Moving on to the next case. Jessica Camilleri. Jessica Camilleri, a woman from Sydney, Australia, decapitated her mother in a tragic incident that took place on the night of July 20, 2019. Having endured humiliation at school due to her evident cognitive delays and learning disabilities, Jessica withdrew into deep resentment. She developed aggressive tendencies whenever she felt threatened or believed she was being mistreated, which could range from something as minor as a stranger's look to her mother's refusal to provide extra food. Her paranoia gradually intensified, driven by an obsession with horror films such as the 1974 Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This movie, infamous for its extreme violence, was banned in multiple countries, including Australia and the United Kingdom. It tells the story of a group of young people in Texas being hunted by chainsaw-wielding cannibals. On that dreadful Saturday night, Jessica used 7 kitchen knives to stab her mother repeatedly in the skull, decapitate her, and then hurl her head into a neighbor's yard. After committing the act, she shockingly asked police officers whether a doctor could sew her mother's head back on to bring her back to life. Jessica Camilleri was the younger daughter of Rita and Vince, an Australian Maltese couple. Unlike her elder sister, Christy, Jessica was born with an intellectual disability. While an average person's IQ ranges between 90 and 110, Jessica's IQ was measured between 55 and 60, placing her in the lowest 1% and classifying her mental delay as mild. Individuals with mild intellectual disabilities generally learn to speak, read, write, and perform basic arithmetic later than others, though they can still communicate and function in daily life. Jessica experienced delays in reaching developmental milestones such as walking, talking, and developing coordination. Because of her condition, she began school much later than her peers, where she quickly faced discomfort, ridicule, and bullying for being different. Jessica managed the resulting stress and anxiety through anger, especially directed toward females, and developed intermittent explosive disorder. This condition is characterized by sudden, repeated episodes of impulsive, aggressive, and violent behavior, as well as angry verbal outbursts that are grossly disproportionate to the situation. Intermittent explosive disorder typically manifests by the age of 6 and worsens during adolescence and early adulthood. It is not merely a typical tantrum, but a psychological disorder linked to a deficiency of serotonin, the brain chemical responsible for regulating mood. In school, Jessica frequently lashed out at both students and teachers, once biting a male classmate and refusing to release him, which resulted in her indefinite suspension and permanent confinement at home under the care of her mother, Rita, who relied on a disability pension. In addition to her intellectual disability and uncontrollable episodes of rage, Jessica was also diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, a chronic neurological disorder affecting millions of children worldwide and impairing their ability to regulate behavior. Furthermore, she suffered from severe bipolar disorder, depression, and anxiety. Jessica was also diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, which affected her judgment, self-awareness, emotional understanding, and empathy toward others. Autism made even simple daily activities, such as shopping, using public transport, managing bank transactions, or holding a job, extremely difficult for Jessica. She developed peculiar obsessions, including a fixation on her three favorite numbers, 2, 3, and 5, which she associated with her favorite colors, yellow, green, and purple, respectively. Jessica often repeated these numbers to create random phone numbers, which she would dial compulsively in attempts to talk to strangers, typically men. On one occasion, she became fixated on a family in Bangladesh, calling their home up to 100 times a day simply because she liked the sound of their phone number. In 2018, Jessica began harassing the employees of a meat company in Daylesford, England, eventually targeting the company's owner, Matthew Layfield, and his family with threats, claiming she would decapitate them with a chainsaw. Jessica's obsession with horror films was another aspect of her unrestrained behavior. She spent countless hours rewatching violent movies such as Saw, Jeepers Creepers, and most notably her favorite, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. A film depicting a group of young people in Texas hunted by cannibalistic killers wielding chainsaws. The film was banned in several countries, including Australia and the United Kingdom, due to its graphic violence. Whenever her mother, Rita, tried to restrict her from watching these movies, Jessica would erupt in rage. Jessica and her mother lived alone in their home in St. Clair, a suburb of Sydney, New South Wales. Her father, Vince, had divorced Rita during Jessica's teenage years, unable to cope with their daughter's ongoing behavioral issues. The strain of Jessica's uncontrollable outbursts ultimately destroyed the marriage. Despite her low self-esteem and childlike, naive demeanor, Jessica exhibited strong narcissistic tendencies. Deep down, she believed she was special and deserving of special treatment because of her mental disability, which at times made her manipulative and self-centered. Rita, however, remained steadfast in her devotion. Aware of her daughter's fragile mental state, she considered it her duty to care for and protect Jessica. She even contacted one of the individuals Jessica had harassed to personally apologize, admitting she no longer knew how to control her daughter. Although Jessica loved her family, her attachment to her mother was especially intense. Rita devoted her life to meeting Jessica's needs, choosing to keep her at home rather than placing her in a psychiatric care facility where she might have received professional treatment. Her entire existence revolved around her daughter's welfare. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, 1 in 5 Australians, about 20% of the population, or roughly 4.8 million people, reported having a mental or behavioral condition between July 2017 and June 2018. Women were more likely than men to report such conditions, and young people aged 15 to 24 had the highest proportion of mental or behavioral disorders. Mental illness is defined as a clinically diagnosable condition that affects a person's cognitive, emotional, or social functioning, encompassing a wide spectrum of disorders, including depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and various psychotic disorders. Autism made even simple daily activities, such as shopping, using public transport, managing bank transactions, or holding a job, extremely difficult for Jessica. She developed peculiar obsessions, including a fixation on her three favorite numbers, 2, 3, and 5, which she associated with her favorite colors, yellow, green, and purple, respectively. Jessica often repeated these numbers to create random phone numbers, which she would dial compulsively in attempts to talk to strangers, typically men. On one occasion, she became fixated on a family in Bangladesh, calling their home up to 100 times a day simply because she liked the sound of their phone number. In 2018, Jessica began harassing the employees of a meat company in Daylesford, England, eventually targeting the company's owner, Matthew Layfield, and his family with threats, claiming she would decapitate them with a chainsaw. Jessica's obsession with horror films was another aspect of her unrestrained behavior. She spent countless hours rewatching violent movies such as Saw, Jeepers Creepers, and most notably her favorite, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. A film depicting a group of young people in Texas hunted by cannibalistic killers wielding chainsaws. The film was banned in several countries, including Australia and the United Kingdom, due to its graphic violence. Whenever her mother, Rita, tried to restrict her from watching these movies, Jessica would erupt in rage. Jessica and her mother lived alone in their home in St. Clair, a suburb of Sydney, New South Wales. Her father, Vince, had divorced Rita during Jessica's teenage years, unable to cope with their daughter's ongoing behavioral issues. The strain of Jessica's uncontrollable outbursts ultimately destroyed the marriage. Despite her low self-esteem and childlike, naive demeanor, Jessica exhibited strong narcissistic tendencies. Deep down, she believed she was special and deserving of special treatment because of her mental disability, which at times made her manipulative and self-centered. Rita, however, remained steadfast in her devotion. Aware of her daughter's fragile mental state, she considered it her duty to care for and protect Jessica. She even contacted one of the individuals Jessica had harassed to personally apologize, admitting she no longer knew how to control her daughter. Although Jessica loved her family, her attachment to her mother was especially intense. Rita devoted her life to meeting Jessica's needs, choosing to keep her at home rather than placing her in a psychiatric care facility where she might have received professional treatment. Her entire existence revolved around her daughter's welfare. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, 1 in 5 Australians, about 20% of the population, or roughly 4.8 million people, reported having a mental or behavioral condition between July 2017 and June 2018. Women were more likely than men to report such conditions, and young people aged 15 to 24 had the highest proportion of mental or behavioral disorders. Mental illness is defined as a clinically diagnosable condition that affects a person's cognitive, emotional, or social functioning, encompassing a wide spectrum of disorders, including depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and various psychotic disorders. These conditions profoundly affect a person's emotions, behavior, and social interactions, often influencing not only the individual, but also their family members and caregivers. The tragedy that occurred on July 20th, 2019, was not an isolated incident. 6 years before the Camilleri family's calamity, Jessica had already faced multiple convictions for common assault causing actual bodily harm. She had also attacked relatives, including an aunt and her sister's mother-in-law, by pulling their hair. Despite these repeated acts of aggression, Jessica was never incarcerated. She was always placed under the care of the one person who could tolerate her, her mother, Rita. Jessica's violent tendencies extended beyond the family circle. She often lashed out at women in public places, such as streets and shopping centers, whom she believed were staring at her or making her feel embarrassed. On one occasion, she was banned from a doctor's office after becoming paranoid and physically aggressive toward another patient in the waiting room. In early 2018, while accompanying Rita to the hospital, Jessica assaulted a nurse. Following the incident, she was admitted to a mental health unit for 9 days due to a severe mood disorder episode. Doctors treated her with lithium for a suspected bipolar disorder, along with antipsychotic medications. However, by the end of 2018, approximately 6 months before the fatal event, Jessica discontinued her prescribed medications and turned instead to natural remedies in an attempt to manage her condition. Rita, desperate for a solution, resorted to unconventional methods. She paid $2,500 to a medium on Queen Street in St. Mary's, a western suburb of Sydney, hoping to exorcise what she believed was an evil spirit tormenting her daughter. Family and friends repeatedly warned her about the risks of living with Jessica, but Rita refused to accept that her daughter could be dangerous. Christy, Jessica's older sister, described their mother as having a heart of gold, someone who always prioritized others, including Jessica, who persistently rejected professional treatment. Rita's sister echoed similar sentiments, acknowledging Rita's unconditional love for her troubled daughter and often expressing fear that Jessica might eventually harm her. Tragically, Rita's unwavering devotion blinded her to these warnings. Even the day before the fatal attack, she ignored the signs of danger after being forced to take Jessica to a police station because her daughter had once again made threatening phone calls to strangers. On July 20th, 2019, the fragile relationship between mother and daughter reached its breaking point. Jessica felt humiliated after her mother allegedly embarrassed her in front of a man who merely walked past them in a parking lot. Later that day, after visiting her sister, the two women returned home. Jessica asked her mother to order more food from Red Rooster, but Rita refused. Jessica then called the restaurant herself multiple times. At 9:18 p.m., 9:19 p.m., 9:20 p.m., and finally at 9:21 p.m. Shortly after, Jessica demanded that her mother call a doctor to their home. Rita complied, But when the doctor arrived, he was so frightened by Jessica's behavior that he fled, with Jessica chasing him until he managed to escape in his car. Rita, out of patience and options, told Jessica she would call the emergency number and request an ambulance to take her immediately to the mental health care system. Jessica's worst episode of rage was about to unfold. That night of July 20th, 2019, 57-year-old Rita was dragged by her hair to the kitchen of her own home by Jessica. Using 7 meat cleavers, 4 of which broke, Jessica stabbed her mother over 100 times in the head and neck. This act of mutilation was driven by more than uncontrollable anger. It reflected Jessica's macabre curiosity, influenced by her obsession with the horror films she watched daily. The forensic pathologist's autopsy revealed that Rita had suffered monumental injuries to her head and neck and died from multiple stab wounds with decapitation at the second vertebra in her upper neck. Rita's body also had over 90 defensive wounds, indicating she was conscious for a significant part of the attack. Experiencing extreme physical pain and emotional terror from what her daughter, whom she had devotedly cared for, was doing. During this gruesome scene, Jessica's nephew, the 4-year-old son of her older sister, Christy, was present. He had been under Rita's care for a few days due to Jessica's seeming improvement. The boy witnessed Jessica stabbing his grandmother multiple times and decapitating her. When he tried to intervene, Jessica, whom he called the little bastard, slightly injured him in the head. The young boy started vomiting upon witnessing the horrific scene. After killing her mother, Jessica called the emergency number from Rita's cell phone and confessed to murdering her mother, claiming self-defense, alleging that Rita had attacked her first. Jessica felt she had to act fast and began repeatedly stabbing her mother. After decapitating and stabbing her mother over 100 times, Jessica dumped the head in a nearby neighbor's front yard. When the police arrived at the house in St. Clair, Sydney, New South Wales, Jessica was outside, her clothes stained with Rita's blood, holding a water bottle. She showed no remorse for her actions, only worrying about what would happen to her next. Jessica asked the police officers and later the detectives at the crime scene if it was possible to bring someone back to life who had been decapitated, believing in the possibility of medical miracles that could reattach her mother's head. A police officer responded that this idea was rather unrealistic. Yet Jessica insisted, thinking that doctors could perform miraculous surgeries and reattach her mother's head. She also inquired if she would face any consequences, like the death penalty for killing her mother. When told that Australia does not have capital punishment, Jessica felt relieved. She also confessed to the police that the idea of decapitating her mother came from the horror movies she watched compulsively. This chilling conversation was recorded on the body camera of a police officer when he arrived at the scene at 11:43 p.m. on July 20th, 2019. First responders described the scene as one of the most horrific they had ever encountered. The day after the crime, on July 21st, 2019, Jessica appeared at the court but did not apply for bail. A friend told the media that this was not surprising, as Jessica likely did not understand what bail meant. After a trial highlighting her long history of mental illness, Jessica was found guilty of manslaughter in December 2020, having pleaded not guilty to murder due to disability. In early 2021, she was sentenced to a maximum of 21 years and 7 months in prison with a non-parole period of 16 years and 2 months, making her eligible for parole on September 19, 2035. The prosecutor told the court that Rita's gruesome murder was the peak of a lifetime of escalating violence from Jessica, progressing from hair pulling to a deadly explosive attack. He also argued that Jessica was assessed as a moderate to high risk of reoffending and remained a continuous danger to the community. Christy, Jessica's older sister, stated that Jessica had killed and butchered their mother, and that she could never forgive her for her actions. Rita's sister hoped that Jessica would receive the necessary help, and that Rita could rest in peace knowing Jessica was cared for by a system that had failed her in life. The case judge offered counseling services to the jury members, acknowledging that the distressing evidence they had heard could stay with them long after the trial. The judge acknowledged that during the jury selection process, many individuals refused to participate in a trial like Jessica's. She also stated that Rita's murder was one of the most severe cases of homicide a court could encounter. She described it as a crime of extraordinary cruelty and brutality, exacerbated by its occurrence in the victim's own home. Jessica's lawyer mentioned that his client had expressed remorse in a letter sent to her family after the crime. In the letter, Jessica admitted that Rita had not hit her and acknowledged that it was her fault that her mother was no longer alive. However, one of the psychiatrists who evaluated her noted that Jessica did not use social gestures to communicate and displayed a rather mild lack of emotion on her face. The psychiatrist also found no signs of schizophrenia or auditory or visual hallucinations in Jessica. The conclusion reached was that Jessica's risk factors could only be managed over the long term with a comprehensive mental health support plan. Jessica was assigned to the highest security unit within the women's section of the correctional complex. Since entering incarceration, Jessica has continued to create disturbances. On September 9, 2019, merely 2 months after her arrival, she hurled a teacup at another inmate following a dispute concerning food trading. The following day, she faced an assault charge in the local court but received no additional sentence. On October 14, 2019, she assaulted another inmate, which resulted in 5 days of solitary confinement in her cell. On November 3, 2019, she ignored an order, and on July 31, 2020, she caused property damage, incurring a fine of $200. Another assault incident on November 21, 2020, resulted in 7 days of solitary confinement. In January 2021, she was once again convicted of common assault without any further penalty. Jessica has justified her actions by asserting that no matter what she does or where she goes, other prisoners will make her existence unbearable. She further stated that prison life is harsh and incomparable to the outside world. Mental health disorders are common among inmates. As per the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, 40% of Australian prisoners were diagnosed with mental illnesses in 2018. Additionally, data indicates that 1 in every 5 individuals with mental disorders will come into contact with the criminal justice system at some stage in their lives. Although there is no direct causal relationship between having a mental condition and committing a crime, these numbers reveal that numerous people in Australian prisons had pre-existing psychological conditions. Studies demonstrate that individuals with mental illnesses are more inclined to engage in criminal behavior, particularly those suffering from psychotic disorders, as such episodes can lead to unlawful acts. Symptoms of bipolar disorder may be directly linked to criminal actions. Extreme anxiety or stress can heighten the probability of violent behavior because of increased anger, agitation, or impulsiveness. Nevertheless, there is another perspective to consider. The prison environment can aggravate pre-existing mental health disorders, with violence and cruelty from fellow inmates or correctional officers potentially triggering or worsening psychological conditions. According to the Australia Policy Development Centre, prison is a dreadful environment for someone with a mental illness. In the Sydney Supreme Court on May 15, 2023, Justice Peter Hamill rejected claims that Camilleri's sentence was manifestly excessive and that the sentencing judge had erred in evaluating the seriousness of the crime. Justice Hamill, however, ruled that Camilleri should be resentenced with the support of Justices Christine Adamson and Richard Kavanaugh. He noted that her behavior of walking into the street carrying her mother's head and dropping it, as well as asking emergency service personnel whether they could reattach it, demonstrated how detached her actions were from reality. Based on the testimony of several psychiatrists and a psychologist, Justice Hamill concluded that Camilleri possessed only a limited comprehension of moral wrongfulness because of her intellectual disability and autism spectrum disorder. He ordered that she be resentenced to a prison term of 16 years, with a non-parole period of 12 years. Moving on to the next case. Leilani Simon. The case of Leilani Simon. Leilani Simon resides with her 20-month-old son, Quinton, and her boyfriend in a house situated in Savannah, Georgia, United States. On the morning of October 5, 2022, she contacted 911 to report that her son, Quinton, had disappeared from his playpen. She initially stated that her son had been abducted. Police began interrogating Simon, Quinton's mother, who was the final person to see the child before he went missing. During the questioning, she provided contradictory statements, particularly concerning her actions the evening prior and the morning of Quinton's disappearance. Surveillance cameras near Simon's residence captured activity that did not correspond with her claims on the day of the occurrence. In addition, Cell phone evidence demonstrated that she had gone to a location near a nearby landfill shortly after Quinton was reported missing. Suspecting Simon's role in Quinton's disappearance, the authorities decided to investigate Simon more closely. They questioned relatives and neighbors to better understand the relationship between her and Quinton. Quinton's grandparents declared that she had been negligent and abusive toward her child. These testimonies raised doubts about the boy's safety while living under his mother's care. Simon's acquaintances also disclosed further details about her family struggles, including her inability to provide proper care for her son. A significant witness in the case was Quinton's babysitter. She declared that Simon repeatedly failed to devote enough care or attention to the boy. She recounted troubling behavior, such as Simon being detached and emotionally indifferent toward the child. The babysitter also described observing Simon push the boy into the pool and neglect to assist him when he was hurt. Such statements played an essential role in establishing Simon's mistreatment of her child. While the search for Quinton persisted, Simon was discovered drinking in a bar with her mother, Billie Jo Howell. This conduct generated public indignation, as it conflicted with the image of a mother urgently seeking her missing child. Based on these elements, on October 12, 2022, police identified Simon as the main suspect. However, they did not at once arrest her and proceeded to gather additional proof to clarify the case. Investigators commenced searching the home where Quinton lived before he vanished. They uncovered no evidence of forced entry or violence, which excluded the possibility that the child had been kidnapped by a stranger. They subsequently located traces of organic substances and a peculiar odor inside the household's garbage, which directed them to broaden the search to a landfill nearby. After many days of examining the surrounding landfill areas, they still failed to discover any trace of the child. Investigators identified a new lead in the case when they obtained data from surveillance cameras near Simon's residence. They examined her movements and determined that garbage from a dumpster close to her residence was being transported to a landfill in Chatham County, Georgia. They promptly began searching the landfill, suspecting that Quinton's body might be located there. Around 40 officials from different agencies, including the FBI and local police, together with forensic specialists and technicians, participated in the search. They combed through the landfill for more than a month, but the task was challenging because of the immense volume of garbage and the compressed condition of the waste, which made locating the body extremely complex. Quinton's remains had been in the landfill for an extended period, creating a serious risk of decomposition and difficulties in detecting evidence. This created immense pressure, forcing the search team to proceed swiftly. After more than a month of searching, on November 18, 2022, the search team located human remains at the landfill. The remains were transported to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, for examination. There, scientists confirmed that they belonged to Quinton. Soon afterward, on November 21, 2022, Simon was taken into custody in Chatham County, Georgia. The arrest followed a comprehensive investigation and occurred once authorities had compiled sufficient evidence against her. She was subsequently indicted by a grand jury in Chatham County, Georgia, on December 14, 2022. She faces 19 counts, including malice murder, 2 counts of aggravated murder, concealment of another individual's death, and several counts of giving false statements. These charges are directly connected to the killing of her son, Quinton. Based on the investigation, Simon became enraged and struck her son Quinton to death. This act may have been linked to her drug consumption. She then concealed the body in a trash container and fabricated a story regarding the child's disappearance in order to mislead authorities. A preliminary hearing took place on October 9, 2024, with numerous witnesses testifying. The babysitter testified that Simon had mistreated Quinton, including pushing him into the swimming pool and neglecting to assist him when he was harmed. Several relatives also testified that Simon was careless and abusive toward her child. The evidence, including the babysitter's testimony and the recovery of Quinton's body in the dumpster, supported the prosecution's assertion that Simon murdered her son. After reviewing the evidence and witness accounts, the jury convicted Simon on all 19 charges connected to the death of her son, Quinton. The charges included 2 counts of murder, concealment of a death, and making false statements. However, the defense maintained that the case relied on hearsay and conjecture, and that the proof was inadequate to sustain a murder conviction. As the trial neared its conclusion, Simon's defense attorneys requested the judge to rule that there was insufficient evidence for a jury to convict her of murder and the concealment of Quentin's death. They urged the judge to deliver a direct verdict of acquittal on those specific charges. The judge rejected that request. Simon's trial was held on November 21, 2024, in Chatham County Superior Court. During the proceedings, prosecutors stressed that Simon displayed no remorse. She only expressed regret about being arrested and having to stand trial. Throughout the trial, she also failed to provide a coherent explanation to justify her conduct and was unable to disprove the evidence brought against her in court. Under Georgia law, murder carries a penalty of life imprisonment. Since prosecutors did not pursue the death penalty, Judge Tammy Stokes was only required to decide whether Simon would have the possibility of parole. Consequently, Simon was sentenced to life imprisonment but will be eligible for parole after serving 30 years. Furthermore, the judge imposed an additional 10-year sentence for concealing Quentin's death. She has the right to file an appeal within 30 days of sentencing. When she heard the judgment, she merely stood up and nodded, as though she accepted it. She made no statement. After Simon received her life sentence, her defense counsel submitted an appeal requesting a new trial. Moving on to the next case. Lucy Landry. By the middle of 2009, after 7 years of marriage, Lucy Landry began a relationship with Gareth Jenkins, an old school acquaintance she had reconnected with through Facebook. She had grown weary of the 24-year age gap with her husband and his controlling behavior, which had left her feeling increasingly isolated and disappointed. She asked her husband for a divorce and insisted that he, who was battling prostate cancer, pay £6,000 for a new apartment for her and Mr. Jenkins to move into. The couple started to argue endlessly over financial matters. On February 1st, in front of a neighbor, Lucy mocked her husband about nude photos he had taken of himself 3 months earlier, which she had discovered on his computer, calling him a pervert and ridiculing him by saying he should be listed on the sex offenders register. That night, they fought violently, following each other throughout the house, shouting and hurling insults over money, property, and Mr. Jenkins. The confrontation ended in a way that no one could have foreseen. Lucy Davies was born in 1971 in the county of Rhondda, England. She was the daughter of Roger and Andrea Davies, who were also the proud parents of another daughter named Anna. The family lived in a small community, primarily made up of social housing. There, amid the stunning mountain backdrop, Lucy experienced a particularly joyful childhood. Since she and her younger sister shared similar interests, they were always extremely close. Her parents often emphasized Lucy's infectious happiness as one of her defining traits. During her years in primary school, Lucy was recognized for her cheerful and sociable personality, which instantly made her well-liked by both teachers and classmates. Alongside her pleasant demeanor, she was also admired for her striking beauty, which made her one of the most popular and respected students in the school. When it came to activities beyond academics, both she and Anna shared a love for ponies. Aware of this, their father delighted them by enrolling both sisters in the local riding club. This sporting pursuit taught them discipline and highlighted their skill. As a result, they earned the privilege of competing and representing the club in numerous events and competitions. Therefore, by the beginning of secondary school, Lucy excelled as an outstanding equestrian. However, her energy and enthusiasm extended far beyond the riding arena, as the versatile young woman began taking lessons in both the flute and piano, devoting long hours of practice to perfect her ability in both instruments. Her dedication soon produced results, and within a year, she had achieved an extensive and precise understanding of classical music. Because of this, she was accepted into a youth orchestra and also joined her school's choir group. As is common during adolescence, a budding romantic interest emerged in her life, and Lucy developed a close relationship with Gareth Jenkins. Nevertheless, she preferred to keep it private. In 1989, after completing secondary school, Lucy was determined to build a career in the field of music. With that goal firmly in mind, she enrolled to pursue a bachelor's degree at the University of Warwick. There, she began a new and promising chapter of her life, always motivated by the ambition of becoming a teacher and dedicating herself to musical education. However, things did not unfold as she had anticipated. Although her enthusiasm for music remained intact, she found herself dissatisfied with the structure and focus of the degree program. As a result, she chose to abandon her original plan and decided instead to study urban planning. It was during this period that she met Graham McAllister. The two quickly discovered that they shared a remarkably similar perspective on life. Beyond their mutual love of art and shared passions, a defining element in their connection was their extravagant sense of humor, which perfectly complemented one another. Their relationship developed effortlessly, and as they began to envision their future together, Lucy decided to introduce Graham to her parents. For Roger and Andrea, the meeting went wonderfully, as they were convinced that Graham was the ideal partner for their daughter. So much so that they chose to purchase a house for Lucy in the city of Coventry, northwest of London. This act, in addition to sparing her the instability of rent and frequent relocations, expressed their hope that she would soon start a family. Shortly after settling in, she invited her boyfriend to move into the new home with her. As they continued their studies, in 1995 the young couple welcomed their first child, a son they named James. Lucy decided that it would be best to take a break from university to care for him. Meanwhile, Graham continued his academic pursuits and, in order to contribute to the household finances, took a night shift job at the city's postal sorting office. Over time, this arrangement began to wear on Lucy, as she found herself alone at home, devoted entirely to childcare, and spending long hours apart from her partner. A growing sense of boredom gradually set in. Seeking some form of relief, she turned to exploring internet chat rooms for entertainment. Within that digital space, she sought to connect with new people. One evening, while Lucy was engaged in animated conversations across several chat rooms, she came into contact with Harold Landry. At 53 years old and of American descent, Harold came from a modest and financially troubled family in Louisiana. Nonetheless, he realized early in life that, as one among a dozen siblings, he would have to earn every success through his own determination and effort. Thus, from a young age, he committed himself to hard work as a means to escape poverty. His opportunity eventually arose when he recognized that in the oil industry, the real profit did not lie in owning an oil well, but rather in providing the necessary infrastructure to those who did. Consequently, he established his own company, dedicated exclusively to the design and production of hydraulic equipment for major oil corporations in the southern United States. As he had foreseen, the enterprise enabled him to accumulate significant wealth, ultimately reaching billionaire status. By that point, he divided his time between his eccentric pastimes and a luxurious property located on the island of Cozumel in Mexico. On a personal front, he had been married and divorced twice. From these marriages, he had children whose precise number and identities were never made public. What was known, however, was that Harold ensured they wanted for nothing. A particularly notable event occurred in 1992 when, being single once again, he became involved with a married woman 20 years younger than himself. Neither her husband nor her family proved to be an obstacle for Harold, who focused his entire charm and persuasive energy on winning her affection, and ultimately succeeded. On February 6, 1994, Harold picked her up to take her on a drive around New Orleans. For the evening, they arranged for a babysitter to care for the woman's children. When the outing came to an end, Harold accompanied his lover back to her home and then offered to give the babysitter a ride to her residence. No one seemed worried about the possibility that the husband might learn of the affair and react out of anger and betrayal. In fact, that was precisely what occurred. Outside the house, the deceived husband was secretly observing his wife's every movement. When the other man said his goodbyes and left, the husband began following him in his car. A few minutes later, Harold realized that a vehicle was tailing him. Then, almost instinctively, he opened the glove compartment and drew the gun he usually kept inside. When both cars stopped at a red light, the situation escalated uncontrollably, as the babysitter would later recount. Harold pointed a revolver at the enraged husband and fired. The bullet struck his neck, severing an artery and damaging a nerve connected to one of his vocal cords. The husband, named Chris Price, collapsed onto the pavement, bleeding from the wound in his neck. Fortunately, there was a hospital directly across the street, which allowed him to receive immediate medical attention, and doctors were able to save his life. As for Harold, he was apprehended and charged with attempted murder. His trial took place in 1997. During his opening remarks, the defense attorney told the jury that Chris had merely been the unfortunate victim of a tragic and sordid affair. Regarding his client, he argued that Harold had acted out of fear and in self-defense. The defense's shrewd strategy persuaded the jury, composed of 4 men and 8 women, to convict Harold of the lesser offense of aggravated assault. Consequently, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. After filing an appeal, Harold was granted probation. In return, he was required to pay a $500 fine and complete a number of community service hours. Although he had hoped for full acquittal, he expressed gratitude to Pat for his diligent efforts. From that point on, they became close friends. Shortly afterward, Harold and Chris reached an undisclosed financial settlement. By the time Harold began communicating with Lucy, he was living in Covington and still possessed enough wealth that working was unnecessary. He was also completely transparent about his line of work and every aspect of his past life, including his romantic relationships and legal experiences. Yet, all these details only deepened Lucy's fascination with him. What followed was a captivating online romance, during which Harold enticed her with promises of an irresistibly luxurious lifestyle. His persistence and charm ultimately paid off when Lucy asked Graham to end their relationship. Thus, Harold found the path clear, without a rival who could cause the kind of problems Chris once had. With everything working in his favor in the early 2000s, Harold traveled to England to meet her in person, and Lucy used the occasion to introduce him to her parents as her new partner. Although Roger and Andrea were taken aback by the considerable age gap, they respected their daughter's choices and raised no objections to the relationship. Feeling deeply fulfilled and lucky to share his life with her, Harold spared no effort to delight her, whether through lavish presents or anything else that captured her fancy. In fact, by that time, he was so enamored that he had already begun planning to propose. However, he wanted the proposal to be extraordinary, set in the perfect place. To bring this plan to life, he took Lucy, her son James, and even Graham on a trip together. The chosen destination was Mexico, which had long been Harold's favorite country in the world. Furthermore, his old friend Pat, who had defended him during his previous trial, owned an apartment near Harold's residence there, adding to the atmosphere of familiarity and ease. Early in the trip, Harold purchased a diamond ring and excitedly shared the news with Pat. Nevertheless, his friend harbored quiet doubts about Harold's soon-to-be fiancée. Over the following days, Pat found it peculiar that Lucy spent a significant amount of time in the company of Graham. Harold, seemingly oblivious to this, went ahead with his plan and proposed. Lucy joyfully accepted. By mid-2003, the couple celebrated their marriage. Shortly thereafter, Harold surprised her by purchasing $1 million property located in an exclusive area of Worcestershire. In this tranquil countryside setting, their marriage began in prosperity and harmony, further enhanced by the presence of wonderful neighbors like Rachel Clark and Stephen Kennedy, with whom Harold and Lucy developed a warm friendship. Before long, the newlyweds welcomed their first daughter, whom they named Harriet. The arrival of the baby brought immense happiness to both Lucy and Harold, and from that moment onward, he devoted himself entirely to the little girl with unwavering love and dedication. Equally affectionate was his bond with James, whom he treated as if he were his own son. Yet, the relentless passage of time gradually began to wear away their initial happiness. Gradually, the demands made towards Lucy increased, and her moodiness became directly proportional to her husband's demands. As he saw it, his wife was to constantly adjust to his preferences and adopt a submissive role to his requests. She, on the other hand, had different expectations, so tensions quickly became apparent. As a conclusion, Lucy was direct and unafraid to express her thoughts. And in this dynamic, her husband was not willing to yield. With both having volatile personalities, their arguments often culminated in explosive breakups, followed by reconciliation once the storm had passed. Thus, moments that had once been pleasurable, like the children's vacations, became increasingly marred by fights. Meanwhile, James witnessed the disintegration of his mother and stepfather's relationship. To their neighbors' dismay, the disputes that stretched on for hours became a sort of regular soundtrack. By that time, Rachel and Stephen were aware that the couple had a tendency to abuse alcohol, knowing well that this was the fuel that ignited their shouting and complaints. When Lucy and Harold unleashed all their anger, leading to prolonged periods of not speaking to each other, their neighbors felt peace return. In mid-2009, thanks to social media, Lucy reconnected with Gareth. Having had no contact since their platonic love in secondary school, they caught up and chatted for hours with necessary interruptions due to both of their commitments. After Harold went to sleep, his wife stayed in front of the screen. Soon it became evident to him that, feeling unhappy, his wife had resorted to the same escape route through which she had found him, and he had no doubt she was looking for a replacement. However, far from confronting her, he considered giving her some space and traveled to Mexico, where he stayed for a while. Meanwhile, Lucy took the opportunity to invite Gareth to stay with her. In the autumn of 2009, her husband returned to England, thinking this time would resolve their marriage. But as soon as he stepped into the house, Lucy asked him for a divorce. Initially, he felt devastated. Then after a few weeks, Harold began a relationship. He met this new woman online. She lived in the vicinity and went by the name of Rachel. Parallel to each of their new romances, the divorce negotiations were underway. And as often happens, new conflicts emerged. Especially concerning the house, Lucy expected to keep it to ensure a roof over her children's heads. For Harold, on the other hand, this matter was non-negotiable. His solution was to offer her money to buy herself a more modest apartment on her own. At the same time, he completely removed her from his will. When Lucy discovered the decisions made by her still husband, she became furious. Her feelings of resentment toward him led her to reveal everything about Harold's past to her son James, withholding nothing. In the midst of this difficult situation, and given the growing tension she was experiencing, Gareth invited her to spend a few days with him in Wales. Once she returned to her usual surroundings, Lucy no longer felt the need to conceal or disguise her long phone conversations with her new partner. Meanwhile, both she and Harold had fallen into excessive alcohol consumption. Their arguments grew increasingly intense, reaching alarming levels, and leaving the children trapped in a violent and unbearable environment. On the afternoon of Monday, February 1st, 2010, Harold drank several glasses of wine. At one point, he received a package addressed to Stephen. Around 9 o'clock that evening, when Stephen returned from work, he found a delivery notice indicating that his parcel had been left with his neighbor. Seeing that the laundry's lights were still on, he went over to retrieve it. Harold invited him inside and poured him a glass of wine. After greeting Lucy and exchanging a few words, Stephen quickly noticed how intoxicated his host was. He collected his package, politely excused himself, and left. Shortly after, the couple began yet another meaningless argument, this time over some furniture Lucy intended to purchase for their upcoming move. James reacted as he had learned to do after years of witnessing conflict. However, this time the confrontation escalated into physical violence. During the altercation, Harold seized a kitchen utensil and struck Lucy on the cheek with it. Unable to ignore the situation any longer, James entered the room and found his mother injured. He immediately called the police, and then focused on ensuring the safety of his younger sister. Shortly afterward, Lucy and her children left the house in search of help. The first place she thought to go was Stephen's home. However, just as she was heading that way, Harold caught up with her and, wielding a knife, inflicted multiple wounds upon her. He then left her lying beneath a bush in the garden and walked away. Hearing the screams, Stephen rushed outside. After only a few steps, he came upon his neighbor. Although he initially thought she was unconscious, he soon realized the gravity of the situation. At that very moment, responding to the emergency call, police officers arrived at the scene. They summoned paramedics and began searching the area for the attacker. However, they found only the children, hidden and terrified in the dark backyard. Once the paramedics arrived, they worked as swiftly as possible, and Lucy was transported to the hospital. Very shortly thereafter, her heart stopped. Meanwhile, Harold went to Rachel's house and admitted that something terrible had happened, though he withheld any further details. He then handed her 3 bank drafts amounting to a total of $40,000, a sum of cash, the keys to his car, and several signed blank checks. After doing so, he set off to return home. By that time, several police patrol units were already searching for him. Eventually, officers located him walking along the road and proceeded to arrest him. Roger and Andrea were consumed with despair upon receiving the devastating news. In a statement released through the police, they requested privacy during their period of unbearable grief following the loss of their daughter. For the moment, they had no further comment for the media. From that point onward, their entire focus shifted to caring for their grandchildren. The forensic report confirmed that Lucy had died from multiple stab wounds to her chest. With this evidence in hand, and having James as an eyewitness, on February 5, 2010, Harold appeared before the court, where he was formally charged with murder. The trial commenced in early February 2011 and was presided over by Judge David Foskett. On this occasion, Pat did not serve as his defense attorney. That responsibility was assumed by lawyer Andy Childs. Despite the obvious difficulty of his assignment, the defense attorney argued that his client had been provoked by his wife's rage and that she had left him with no other choice but to act as he did. During his initial testimony, Harold, through tears, declared that he loved Lucy and deeply regretted what had happened. He then aligned himself with his attorney's strategy, admitting to involuntary manslaughter on the grounds that, in his words, Lucy had pushed him beyond his limits. To emphasize the brutality of the case, the prosecution presented a highly detailed animation illustrating the numerous injuries the victim had sustained. The presentation was deeply disturbing to everyone present in the courtroom. Finally, on February 24, 2011, after fewer than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Harold Landry guilty of murdering his wife, Lucy Landry, who was 38 years old at the time of her death, while Harold was 64. The following day was reserved for the judge to deliver the sentence. He spoke sternly to Harold, describing his assault as both indescribable and unforgivable. He also rejected Harold's claims of provocation by Lucy, dismissing them as a futile attempt to excuse his own actions. Consequently, Harold was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 16 years before becoming eligible for parole. By then, however, he would be over 80 years old. Lucy's family expressed gratitude not only for the court's decision, but also for the judge's words, which they felt accurately conveyed their own emotions. They acknowledged that the verdict brought some measure of relief to their suffering. However, they also admitted that no length of prison time could restore Lucy's life, and they would have to learn to accept this painful truth. For his part, Harold continued to proclaim his innocence, stating that he hoped to appeal the sentence in the future. Moving on to the next case. Mitzi Sanchez. Happy birthday to you. Before these touching moments of familial warmth and togetherness, a grave ordeal took place for this young girl. On an August afternoon in 2000, her world of childhood dreams was suddenly shattered when she vanished without a trace. What should have been a joyful birthday celebration swiftly turned into a dreadful nightmare. This is the story of Mitzi Sanchez, a girl who suffered a horrifying kidnapping and brutal abuse, yet would later become known throughout the United States as the only child to escape and assist in capturing her attacker, a notorious serial killer. Mitzi Sanchez was born on August 10, 1992, in Vallejo, California, USA. She grew up there alongside her parents, Susana and Juan Carlos, and her 3 elder siblings. Susana worked as a hairdresser, while Juan Carlos made his living as a carpenter. They were a working-class family, leading a calm and modest life. Mitzi was known to be a bright, friendly, and lively girl. By mid-2000, she was enrolled at the same elementary school as her siblings, located around 6 blocks from their house. On the morning of August 10, 2000, Mitzi's family began making preparations for her 8th birthday celebration. Mitzi asked her mother if she could stay home from school that day to help with the party decorations. However, Susana insisted that she attend school, assuring her that everything would be ready and even more delightful upon her return. Filled with excitement for her special day, Mitzi headed off to school in the morning, anticipating the affection of her family and a wonderful party waiting for her return. Susana spent the day baking her daughter's cake and decorating their home with bright balloons and festive banners. It was expected that Mitzi would spend that afternoon celebrating surrounded by her loved ones and closest friends. Yet no one could have foreseen that the joyous event would twist into a horrifying nightmare with an unthinkable end. Mitzi spent the school day eagerly waiting to go home. Every afternoon after school, she would meet up with her brothers and some friends so they could all walk home together. But that particular afternoon, the routine changed. As soon as the dismissal bell rang, Mitzi was eager to rush home and begin the celebration. After all, it wasn't a long walk, and she knew the path by heart. Moreover, her route passed along one of the busiest streets in Vallejo. When she was just 2 blocks from her house, Mitzi saw a car parked at the side of the road. Inside sat a man watching her through the rearview mirror. Mitzi couldn't help but glance back at him. She later described his stare as deeply disturbing. As she drew closer to the car, an uneasy chill coursed through her body, and when her eyes met the driver's, she instantly felt that something was wrong. Nonetheless, she chose to disregard her initial instinct and continued walking straight ahead without glancing to either side. The man kept his eyes fixed on her, and as Mitzi drew nearer, he stepped out of the car. He walked up to her, stopped her, and asked for her assistance. The man claimed that he had injured his hip in a biking accident and requested her help in retrieving a strap that had fallen beneath the seat. Mitzi paused for a brief moment, but being an innocent child, she agreed to help the stranger, unaware that her kindness toward an adult would lead her into a horrifying snare. As she moved closer to the car door, Mitzi sensed the stranger shifting behind her before forcefully pushing her inside the vehicle. Once trapped, she attempted to scream and struggle free, but he was clearly stronger than her. When Mitzi tried to cry out for help, the man seized her from behind and clamped his hand over her mouth to muffle her voice. He violently restrained her, threw her down onto the car floor, and locked the door. Mitzi tried to escape, but the handle would not open from the inside. He threw me into the car and said, "If you try to get out or run, I'm going to shoot you. I have a gun in my truck." I was terrified. I was scared. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know if it was real. I didn't know. I was in shock. The man then got back into the vehicle and drove away. Despite her desperate screams, no one heard her. They drove several blocks, and as they turned left, Mitzi caught a glimpse of her own house passing by through the window. At that moment, she fully understood what was happening and grew terrified that she might never see her family again. She wished with all her heart to be back home instead of inside that car. The man drove to a hardware store parking lot and stopped there. Once parked, he handed Mitzi a set of new clothes and ordered her to change. The first thought that ran through her mind was wondering who might have worn those clothes before. It disturbed her deeply to wear someone else's garments. Although frightened and confused, she obeyed every command of the stranger, not wanting to provoke his anger. Still, she constantly kept the thought of escape alive in her mind. Mitzi was a very intelligent girl. She thought she might discover a hidden moment to flee from the car and make her way back home. Meanwhile, at the Sanchez residence, everything was ready for the party, but it was already 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and Mitzi had still not returned from school. Her older sister began to grow anxious and informed their mother, who decided to contact Mitzi's teacher and several of her friends to ask where she might be. After receiving negative responses from everyone they reached out to, Susanna became frantic, realizing that her daughter was missing. They immediately called 911 to report Mitzi's disappearance and alerted their friends and neighbors, who quickly joined in the search. When the police officers arrived, they went door to door throughout the neighborhood, asking residents if anyone had seen the girl. However, there appeared to be no trace of her anywhere. By that time, Mitzi was already far away from that place. The man had parked the car in a public parking lot, and she noticed there were restrooms nearby. She thought that if he allowed her to go there, she might find a chance to escape. But when she asked, he sternly replied no. The man threatened her by saying he had a gun stored in the trunk of the car and warned her not to attempt to run away, claiming that no one had ever escaped from him. He drove for a long time, continuing until nightfall, then decided to stop at a rest area. There, he began covering the windows with blankets and towels, so no one could see inside the vehicle. Afterward, he took out a chain he already had, wrapped it around Mitzi's ankle, fastened it to the gear shift, and locked it with a padlock. Once done, he stepped out of the car and walked away. When he came back, he pulled out a bottle of alcohol he had bought and forced Mitzi to drink straight from it. After making her drink, he showed her a collection of photographs featuring various naked women. She didn't want to see them and tightly closed her eyes to avoid looking. Then he decided to take photographs of her as well. He retrieved his camera and began snapping pictures. That same night, the man fell asleep inside the car with Mitzi right beside him. Even though she was exhausted and drowsy, she fought hard to stay awake. She was terrified and refused to let her guard down for even a moment. At one point, through a small crack, she noticed flashing blue and red lights outside. They belonged to a police patrol passing through the area. She thought that if she could manage to scream or get out of the car, she might be rescued. However, the man's earlier threat replayed in her mind, convincing her that any attempt to flee could end with her being killed. She watched as the patrol car passed very close, then slowly disappeared from view. Her hope began to fade. She wondered whether she would ever get away and thought about whether her family was worried and searching for her. On August 11th, 24 hours after her disappearance, the police department received a call from an employee at the local landfill who who claimed to have found some clothing tangled in the trash. The officers who arrived at the scene gathered the items for investigation. They turned out to include a sheet from a nearby motel. However, this clue did not yield any meaningful progress in the case. That same day, somewhere else in the city, her captor drove through Vallejo once more. He made her crawl under the seat and covered her with a blanket to keep her hidden from sight. After a few minutes, the man stopped in front of a house and got out. Mitzi did not dare to peek through the window, but she attempted to pull at the chain fastened around her leg, though it was impossible to break free. When he returned, he was holding some papers in his hand. He started the car again, and as they drove off, he told Mitzi that her mother was deeply worried about her. He claimed that he had recently spoken to her, and that she had given him a set of flyers with Mitzi's photo and description to distribute throughout the area. Mitzi felt frustrated realizing that all this time they had been parked in front of her house, and she had not noticed. She had been over 24 hours without food or water, felt very weak. And they had spent most of the day driving around the city and making quick stops. Then, they stopped in the parking lot of a deserted industrial factory. At this point, the man unlocked Mitzi from the chain and ordered her to move to the front seat while he was on the driver's side. It was then that he sexually assaulted her. The helpless child couldn't grasp what was happening, feeling her body overwhelmed by pain. In mere seconds, her life had become a real torment. Despite this, Mitzi held back her tears, not wanting to give him the satisfaction of seeing her in pain. As night fell, she resolved not to close her eyes, feeling an increasing fear of what he might do if she let her guard down. The next morning, on August 12th, they left the parking area and he started driving again. Unknown to Mitzi, the anguish growing inside her each minute she was trapped with this man was matched by the desperation her parents and relatives felt from not knowing her whereabouts. Mitzi had been observant of her captor's small habits, noting that he frequently stopped for cigarettes or alcohol. Whenever they stopped, he would leave her alone and chained for at least 30 minutes. Upon returning, he would often sexually assault her again. However, this time, something was different. The man parked the car to get his cigarettes, and as he always did during these stops, he left her locked and chained inside. When he came back to the vehicle, he did not get in. Instead, he opened the passenger door and leaned toward her. But as he did so, something dropped to the floor without his noticing. He then stood upright and left the car once more, warning her not to look and to stay quiet. Mitzi ignored the warning, curious about what had fallen from his pocket. She got up and leaned toward the driver's seat to see what it was. Her heart filled with hope when she spotted a set of keys on the floor that had slipped from the man's pocket. Perhaps in a drunken moment, he had lowered his guard and failed to notice what had happened. For Mitzi, this was the tiny opening she had been desperately waiting for. One of the keys was smaller than the others, so she assumed it belonged to her lock. Mitzi picked up the keys and immediately inserted the small one into the slot. She turned it, and the lock opened. Mitzi could hardly believe it. She was completely astonished. She removed the chain as quickly as she could, remaining alert in case the man returned before she could get away. Adrenaline rushed through her veins, and her instinct for survival took over. Nothing would stop her now. Fear had turned into her ally, pushing her to flee as fast as possible. As soon as she freed herself from the chain, she climbed out through an open window. When her feet touched the ground, her legs gave out beneath her. She was terribly weak from hunger and the physical abuse she had endured. Still, she refused to stop. Mitzi struggled to stand and began to walk. She would not give up. At that moment, her captor spotted her from a distance and began shouting for her to come back to the car. But Mitzi, far from obeying, started running for her life. Reaching the road, she began waving frantically at passing vehicles speeding by. No one stopped. It was as if no one saw her. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she fought to keep them steady and to continue moving. She managed to cross the street while he chased her, yelling threats. She was terrified but would not stop for anything. She knew that if she slowed down or hesitated even for a second, that monster would kill her. That was when she noticed a truck approaching on the highway. Her captor was closing in. It was now or never. Mitzi chose to run straight onto the road, praying the truck would stop. She waved desperately at the driver, and the truck came to a stop right in front of her. Seeing the open window, she didn't hesitate for an instant. She leapt inside, landing on the man behind the wheel. She slid into the passenger seat and pleaded with him to drive away quickly, explaining that she had been kidnapped and had just escaped. The driver looked around, but saw no one nearby. They sped past the car where she had been held. Mitzi pointed it out, and the man who rescued her wrote down the license plate. For the first time in 2 days, Mitzi finally felt safe. Around 11 in the morning, the police department received an unexpected call. A truck driver reported that a young girl had jumped into his truck, very scared, and claimed to be escaping from a criminal. When the police asked him the girl's name, he said she claimed to be Mitzi Sanchez. In his interview, the driver recounted how the girl appeared out of nowhere, desperately seeking his help. He stated that she was truly frightened and got into his vehicle with the fear that her captor might arrive at any moment and kill her. The police immediately contacted the Sanchez family, and the driver took the girl to the authorities, who informed her that her family had been extremely worried about her, had never lost hope of finding her, and loved her immensely. Her parents were on their way to the police station to reunite with her. When Susana and Juan Carlos arrived, Mitzi ran into her mother's arms, tears streaming down her face. It felt as though they had just woken from a terrible nightmare. The little girl had missed them dearly, and the scene was overwhelmingly emotional. She was the child who had survived the worst of crimes. Mitzi arrived home in her father's arms, where she was greeted by a crowd of people, including neighbors, friends, and relatives. However, she appeared overwhelmed and still scared, seemingly reluctant to receive so much attention. Everyone inside and outside the house joined in singing the happy birthday song that they hadn't been able to celebrate on August 10th. Mitzi was deeply moved and couldn't stop crying in front of the cameras and the crowd surrounding her. Despite the good intentions behind this gesture, it seemed that no one fully grasped the terrifying ordeal she had endured over the 2 days she was away from her loved ones. However, they would soon learn the true story as narrated by her. The police easily traced the suspect's name through the car plate number provided by the truck driver who picked up Mitzi. When they showed the girl a photo of the suspect, she immediately recognized him. They were looking for a man named Curtis Dean Anderson, a 39-year-old taxi driver. Quickly, Mitzi's abduction was linked to other cases involving 2 8-year-old girls who had disappeared months earlier. One was Ziana Fairchild, who had vanished on the same street as Mitzi. The other girl was named Amber Swartz. Curtis was arrested 10 hours after Mitzi was found, and in April 2001 his trial began. Unsurprisingly, Mitzi was the prosecution's key witness. The little girl was called to the stand to recount what had happened from the moment she was walking home and was forced by the accused into his vehicle. Later, Mitzi would remember entering the courtroom and seeing Curtis seated there. Despite being terrified, she knew she had to testify to ensure he remained in jail and could not harm anyone else. The brave young girl sat with a teddy bear in front of the judge, lawyers, and her family, and recounted in vivid detail the nightmare she had survived. Everyone in the courtroom was horrified by what had happened to such a young child. It seemed like something taken straight from a horror film. After her testimony, Curtis was found guilty and sentenced to 251 years in prison. At only 8 years old, Mitzi had not only managed to outwit her captor and escape with her life, but her testimony also ensured that her attacker was imprisoned. Moreover, her case exposed the dark pattern of Curtis, who was found to have had numerous victims prior to the crime for which he was convicted. All of them were girls around Mitzi's age, with her being the only one who survived. Once incarcerated, Curtis confessed to being responsible for 13 additional cases, including those involving Ziana Fairchild and Amber Swartz. He admitted to kidnapping, abusing, and murdering all those little girls. However, he refused to reveal specific details unless he could secure a deal with the authorities, as he feared for his life while in prison. Meanwhile, at the Sanchez home, the family tried to return to normal life. Yet, they soon faced financial strain due to the emotional devastation caused by their daughter's abduction. Mitzi's parents struggled with insomnia and constant anxiety. Their mental state began to affect their work, making it difficult to keep up with bills. They received help from a local organization that provided food, assisted with expenses, and offered psychological support, particularly for Mitzi, who appeared to be entering a post-traumatic phase that her family found difficult to comprehend. Although they attempted to resume their daily lives, the horrific ordeal left deep emotional wounds on Mitzi, who was consumed by anger. This pain was worsened by the bullying she endured at school. Her classmates called her the kidnapped girl and mocked her, claiming she enjoyed the attention brought by the media. At times, their cruelty went even further, with some saying she should have died during her abduction. She attended therapy for 4 years, but recovery proved difficult. Her family encouraged her to join support groups dedicated to finding missing children, which she found meaningful and therapeutic. Still, each time a missing child was discovered deceased, she would sink into profound sadness. As the years passed, the lasting impact of her abduction at only 8 years old became evident. Mitzi grew into a defiant teenager, consuming large amounts of alcohol to numb her pain and escape the memories of her past. But life was about to challenge her once more, and this time, she would have to be the one to rescue herself. On May 1, 2009, at 16 years old, after drinking at a party with friends, Mitzi was involved in a serious car accident. She was ejected through the windshield upon impact, breaking her nose, neck, and an arm. The collision was so severe that she was hospitalized for 2 weeks, during which she remained in a coma. When she regained consciousness, doctors informed her that she was pregnant. From that moment, she resolved to completely transform her life. She began taking better care of herself, gave up drinking, reconnected with her faith, and dedicated herself to her pregnancy and later to motherhood. Mitzi began working at a foundation called Kloss Kids, created by Mark Kloss following the abduction of his own daughter in 1993. Motivated by this project, she decided to establish her own initiative centered on child safety awareness. In 2018, she founded an organization that bore her name. Her extraordinary courage in freeing herself after 2 days of captivity and her ability to turn her personal suffering into a mission to educate and assist others earned her numerous honors. On May 23, 2001, less than a year after her ordeal, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children presented her with a medal, making her the first recipient of the organization's Courage Award. As an adult in 2019, Mitzi Sanchez was recognized as Woman of the Year by California's 14th Assembly District during a ceremony at the state capitol. By 2024, Mitzi is a 32-year-old woman, an exceptional mother, and a relentless activist working through her foundation to support children who are victims of sexual abuse or are missing. Furthermore, she conducts lectures and workshops on safety and prevention to provide young people with stronger tools for self-protection. Moving on to the next case. Yvette Pena. In Kern County, numerous murders occur each year, yet the killing of Yvette Pena in a Bakersfield motel drew the public's attention and became particularly notorious. This tragic incident took place in 2011 and was appalling in its savagery. What made the case even more extraordinary was the person who admitted to the crime, a ruthless man adorned with tattoos. His cold demeanor and the horrifying details of the murder both fascinated and terrified the community. Born on March 7, 1988, in Bakersfield, California, Jamie Osuna's early years unfolded under turbulent circumstances. His mother, Michelle, was only 19 years old at the time, and little is known about his father except that he was 21, rebellious, and undisciplined. Jamie's father exhibited violent tendencies toward Michelle from the beginning, even going so far as to kick her in the stomach while she was pregnant with Jamie. This brutal act inflicted lasting damage on Jamie before he even took his first breath. Some have speculated that this incident might have caused Jamie's ear deformity and possibly influenced his brain development. Aware of her husband's abusive nature, Michelle made the brave choice to divorce him. Soon after, she met Jeff, a man with whom she immediately felt a strong bond, and it appeared Jeff would take on the role of Jamie's stepfather. Jamie's biological father, however, strongly opposed this situation. Despite Michelle's intention to cut all contact with him, he continued to create problems. One disastrous night, he threatened Jeff by pressing a knife to his throat. Fortunately, the conflict did not worsen. He was arrested, and a restraining order was issued against him. This was the final time Jamie's biological father appeared in his story. Shortly after that, Michelle married Jeff, and they began living together with Jamie and his brother, who was 2 years older than him. This marks the point where the narrative takes a grim and unsettling turn. Although Jeff wanted Michelle, he appeared far less willing to take on the responsibilities of a stepfather. Sadly, this ushered in a time of suffering for Jamie, while his older brother was somewhat spared, having gone to live with their grandparents once they learned of Jeff's abusive behavior. It remains uncertain why Jamie was not also taken in by his grandparents, though it appears they refused to care for him, leaving one to question why they would turn away a 3-year-old child. It is also essential to point out that Michelle chose to prioritize her relationship with Jeff over the safety of her two young sons. Jeff's violent conduct was thoroughly documented through the accounts of Michelle, Jamie, and various records from hospitals and law enforcement authorities. On one occasion, during a road trip with Michelle while Jamie was secured in a baby carrier in the back seat, Jamie's crying angered Jeff to such an extent that he began yelling at the child. Shockingly, he then hurled the baby carrier out of the moving vehicle. Fortunately, it landed safely, and Jamie showed no apparent injuries. However, later examinations revealed severe brain trauma that may have resulted from this violent event. Around the age of 5, another distressing episode further darkened Jamie's already chaotic childhood. He accidentally spilled some juice on the floor, which enraged Jeff. In a furious outburst, Jeff seized a belt and began savagely whipping the young boy. This time, Michelle intervened by contacting the police. Jeff was subsequently taken into custody on charges of child abuse because of the visible marks on Jamie's body. Yet, the punishment was relatively mild, and disturbingly, Jeff returned home just 10 days later, with Michelle still supporting him. Even after they had their own children, Jeff continued to mistreat Jamie, depriving him of proper meals and at times forcing him to eat off the floor. Jamie increasingly felt like a stranger within his own home. Michelle, though conscious of her previous failures, found herself incapable of repairing the deep emotional scars that had already been inflicted. By the age of 12, Jamie finally succeeded in escaping his abusive household and went to live with his grandparents. Everyone had come to accept that Jeff's cruelty toward Jamie would never stop. During this time, they began to observe the emotional emptiness that had enveloped Jamie since his early years. Michelle described it as if his spirit had been torn away, leaving him indifferent toward everything and everyone around him. This period marked the beginning of Jamie's disturbing tendencies. He started burning animals in a nearby forest, and when alone at home, subjected his own pet cat to horrifying treatment, locking it in the refrigerator and even the oven. He also resorted to self-inflicted harm, as it appeared to be the only way he could feel anything in a world that otherwise left him completely numb. At the age of 15, Jamie's life took a grim turn when he viciously stabbed another boy, leaving the victim seriously injured but lucky to survive. This criminal act resulted in Jamie's imprisonment in a juvenile detention facility, where he remained for the next 4 years. During this time, Michelle finally faced the magnitude of her neglect toward Jamie, which led her to file for divorce from Jeff. A few years later, Jeff died from a heart attack. Considering his abusive past, it is conceivable that Jamie might have eventually harmed him had he lived longer. On September 14, 2007, Jamie was released from the correctional facility at 19 years old. By this stage, he had gained a notorious reputation as a troublemaker, deeply involved in gang-related activities. He showed no inclination toward education or steady employment, instead choosing a lifestyle defined by partying and constant association with his gang companions. The pivotal moment in this grim story came in December 2008, when a 16-year-old boy's birthday party took an entirely unforeseen direction. This was far from an ordinary celebration filled with Mickey Mouse piñatas and festive decorations. Instead, it attracted a crowd from society's rougher edges, and the lack of any responsible adult supervision was striking. The unconventional event had been arranged by the birthday boy's mother, known for her overly permissive attitude. Joelle Castellano, a 37-year-old single mother of 3, played a crucial role in this unusual narrative. She chose to throw a party for underage youths, which, though highly irresponsible, was not necessarily catastrophic in itself. As the night went on, however, things began spiraling into disorder when Joelle started dancing with a young man, drawing the attention of her nephew. The young relative appeared to become jealous, perhaps due to harboring his own romantic feelings toward his aunt, and decided he wanted to keep others away from her. In an attempt to intimidate the young man, Joelle gestured toward Jamie, who, though not yet marked by the prominent facial tattoos he would later bear, stood at about 5 feet 3 inches tall. Nevertheless, it was Jamie's menacing demeanor and cold attitude that made him appear more intimidating than anyone else present. Jamie agreed to confront the young man, heading into the kitchen where he picked up a knife and warned him to stay away from Joelle. The young man, convinced that Jamie was bluffing, responded with defiance. Yet, Jamie did the unexpected. He stabbed the boy, an act that led to his re-imprisonment. But something had shifted within him this time. He could not rid his mind of one consuming thought: He had fallen deeply in love with Joelle. It was not merely a result of the violent incident, but rather a genuine, passionate attachment. As the saying goes, love can drive people to do things beyond reason. Jamie no longer cared about his situation. He was convinced he could win Joelle's heart. Despite their significant age difference, his incarceration, and the violent circumstances of their first encounter, Jamie began writing heartfelt love letters to Joelle, and in time, she too fell for him. Thus began their long-distance relationship. 11 months later, when Jamie completed his sentence, Joelle arrived in her truck to pick him up. Yet, her confidence faltered upon seeing that Jamie had covered his face with tattoos, casting doubt on the sincerity of their bond. Still, after all the waiting, Jamie's eagerness dominated as he proposed that they spend the night together in a motel. Joelle agreed, though she believed it would only be a one-night encounter. However, Jamie, also known as the sharpshooter, proved unexpectedly persuasive, as that single night resulted in Joelle becoming pregnant. With this development, she felt increasingly compelled to form a permanent bond with him. Just 3 months later, they formalized their relationship through marriage. Jamie made solemn vows to Joelle, assuring her that he understood the pain of growing up in a broken family and pledging to become a loyal husband and dedicated father. Yet, even before their child entered the world, he began displaying abusive tendencies toward Joelle. It was around this period that he started adopting traits reminiscent of the Joker, not as an exaggeration, but because the resemblance was striking. His abuse toward Joelle extended beyond physical harm. It carried a profound psychological component, perhaps rooted in the belief that mental torment could inflict deeper wounds. One incident exemplified this. During a heated confrontation, things escalated beyond control when Jamie seized the ashes of Joelle's late mother from a vase and fled with them. Knowing that Joelle had not yet processed her mother's death, this cruel act devastated her and led her to contact the police. Jamie was subsequently arrested, though the ashes were never recovered. This distressing event resulted in Jamie's return to prison, causing him to miss his child's birth. Upon his release, Joelle decided to give him another chance, holding on to hope that fatherhood might inspire him to become responsible. Sadly, this hope proved misguided. Soon after, Jamie shifted his abusive approach from physical to emotional torment. Joelle responded in a way that deeply unsettled someone like him. She began ignoring him entirely. Regardless of what he said or did, she no longer reacted. One day, in a cruel effort to provoke her, Jamie shoved her 7-year-old son off the bed while maintaining unbroken eye contact with her. This time, his manipulation succeeded. Overcome with anger, Joelle stormed into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and warned him coldly, "Mess with me, but never with my kids." At that moment, Jamie's expression revealed genuine shock and fear. He had not anticipated such defiance. Terrified, he reached out to his gang associates for help escaping the situation. Once outside the house, Jamie turned to methamphetamine use, which explains his prematurely aged appearance, making him look closer to 60 years old. After he ceased officially living with Joelle, he began stalking her from outside her home. Joelle contacted the police, resulting in Jamie's arrest and a 7-month prison sentence for violating his parole. However, within a week of his release, he resumed his harassment of Joelle. She would spot him outside her window, his gaze unwavering, and he would make menacing phone calls, threatening her and her children. Joelle contacted the police once again, but upon their arrival, they failed to locate Jamie. Days passed with no trace of him. Then, on November 8, 2011, Joel received a chilling call from Jamie, in which he uttered the sinister words, "Check the news, I just killed a woman at the Morocco motel." Naturally, Joel's immediate response was to contact the police. However, they didn't take her seriously. What transpired next is where the story takes an eerie turn, as it was 5 days after this call that a motel employee discovered a gruesome crime scene in one of the motel's rooms. The victim was a 37-year-old woman named Yvette, a mother of 6. Details are scarce, but it appears to have been an exceedingly horrific crime scene. Investigators, who deemed it one of the most disturbing cases in their careers, found evidence of 2 knives and scissors used in the slow and torturous manner of death. Jamie, it seemed, harbored a sadistic streak. You might wonder how I have access to these gruesome details. Well, this wouldn't be his solitary murder, nor the most heinous. Even more chilling is the absence of any apparent motive for targeting this woman, strongly suggesting that she became a victim solely because of her resemblance to Joel. Jamie would ultimately face arrest, trial, and sentencing for this horrifying murder. While incarcerated, Jamie took disturbing actions to further torment Joelle. He would occasionally contact Child Protective Services in an attempt to have her custody of her children revoked, knowing that this would inflict the most pain on her. He even went to the extent of trying to hire a hitman to eliminate her. However, because he communicated these intentions through letters, the police intercepted them before they could reach their intended recipient. These actions only added layers to the mask he wore, a facade he maintained to feel something, a desperate attempt to fill the void he had experienced as a child. The trial for the murder of Yvette dragged on for 5 years, during which Jamie displayed no remorse whenever he appeared in court. He would even wave and laugh at the victim's family. This extended trial was a result of Jamie's refusal to confess. It's worth noting that he managed to prolong the trial for more than half a decade by remaining silent. However, on March 24, 2017, just 3 days before the final trial, where the verdict was still uncertain, a news channel offered him an interview. They aimed to capitalize on his striking appearance to generate clicks and had planned to ask him challenging questions to elicit a confession. To everyone's astonishment, they didn't need to ask any questions because Jamie confessed to the murder of Yvette Wright at the start of the interview. It's evident that he did this to gain notoriety, as there is no doubt that he deliberately presented himself as a villain in the news. What supports this claim is his admission to 2 additional murders, one committed at the age of 13 and another at 19. The police began searching for the alleged victims based on Jamie's descriptions, as he had not provided any names. Since he had spent nearly his entire life in Bakersfield, the possibility of error was relatively small. However, the database revealed no missing persons or unsolved murder cases that could be linked to him. Thus, it is highly probable that these confessions were exaggerated or fabricated. Following these admissions, Jamie was inevitably found guilty 3 days later. Nevertheless, he was not sentenced to death because his confession, made on the day of the trial, had caused a 5-year delay and resulted in the waste of considerable time and resources. Yet what continues to puzzle everyone is what unfolded afterward. Upon his arrival in prison, he began exhibiting increasingly unstable and erratic conduct. He smeared his cell walls with his own blood. One tragic night, he was placed in a cell with a man he despised, whom he then savagely stabbed multiple times using a knife. He even inflicted a deep wound on the man's face, requiring 67 stitches to close. Jamie went so far as to request photographs of his victims as keepsakes, highlighting the deeply disturbing nature of his behavior. He had gained notoriety as an inmate too violent and unpredictable to share a cell with anyone. However, in a baffling and irrational decision made in March 2019, Jamie was assigned his first-ever cellmate, a 44-year-old man named Luis Romero. In 1992, when he was just 17, Luis, a native of Guatemala, had joined a gang after arriving in the United States and had taken a life during a clash with rival members. He received a 27-year prison sentence and was nearing the end of his term. Yet, in a shocking and incomprehensible decision, he was placed in the same cell as Jamie, a man guilty of far more brutal crimes. Jamie was fully conscious of the magnitude of his past actions, boasting a long and violent criminal record. Furthermore, he had previously been denied cellmates precisely because of the danger he posed. Luis, meanwhile, was a mere 3 weeks away from being released. Less than 24 hours after the two were housed together, on the morning of March 9, 2019, correctional officers conducting their routine inspection encountered a horrifying scene. Jamie was grinning, wearing a collar. The collar had been fashioned from different parts of Luis's body, and Jamie had carved a grotesque, clown-like smile onto Luis's face. He had desecrated the corpse, written messages on the walls in blood, and declared, "I am the man of 1,000 faces." Now, various theories have begun to emerge, as it is clear that such an atrocity could not have been carried out in merely an hour. It must have taken several hours to perform such horrifying acts. A correctional officer in charge of the nighttime inspection reported that everything appeared normal, even though Luis's body later revealed that the gruesome assault had already been underway at that time. Some guards attempted to justify their negligence by claiming that Jamie had used a blanket to conceal the horrific events in progress. Yet, if an inmate covers their cell door with a blanket, it is the guard's duty to enter and investigate immediately. What happened in this instance was not an isolated event within this particular prison. It occurred in a facility notorious for allegations that guards organized inmate fights while wagering on the results. There are even videos of these staged brawls, complete with an announcer and a commentator. Moreover, suspicions persist that such practices were occasionally used when authorities wanted to eliminate a problematic prisoner. They would set up a fight, and when one inmate began to gain the upper hand, the guards would shoot the other under the pretext of intervening to save a life. This particular case grows even more complicated due to Jamie's clearly deteriorated psychological condition. It is evident that he maintained a deep obsession with the Joker, as seen in the blood-written comic book phrases decorating his cell. It remains unclear how he managed to obtain razors to fashion into weapons, and his letter to a prosecutor, written in the style of the Joker and containing the famous, "Why so serious?" line, raises further questions. The letter also included satanic references, though it is doubtful that he sincerely practiced Satanism. These gestures were most likely acts of attention-seeking. He was diagnosed with an unspecified type of schizophrenia within the spectrum, as well as antisocial personality disorder and borderline personality disorder, conditions marked by impulsive behavior that could explain his tendency to stab others without clear provocation, alongside post-traumatic stress disorder. Consequently, the court deemed him mentally incompetent to stand trial. Therefore, at 33 years old, it seems unlikely that Jamie will face the death penalty, and he will almost certainly spend the remainder of his life imprisoned. Jamie was undeniably deranged, with a hint of dark theatricality. Some might argue that his chaotic upbringing contributed to his downfall. Nonetheless, the extremity of his crimes remains unmatched. Interestingly, his older brother, who had found refuge with their grandparents early in life, has since become a successful man, a millionaire who drives luxury sports cars and enjoys a stable, loving family. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with me. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into cold case investigations. Your support helps me bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like me to cover next. See you in the next video. And remember, the search for truth never stops.